Hello, fabulous listeners. Thanks for tuning in to Old Bodies Outside. This is your host, Ryan Peterson. This episode's guest is Will Dobud. He is an American living in Adelaide, South Australia, and works at Charles Sturt University. For almost 2 decades, he has been working with adolescents in outdoor settings to improve well-being and mental health. He is the founder and director of True North Expeditions, which is a nonprofit program in Adelaide that provides adventure therapy expeditions and social work services for adolescents. Will's research interests include outdoor therapies, feedback informed treatment, and qualitative research involving client voice. Also, he is a co author of the book titled Solution Focused Practice in Outdoor Therapy. I'm certainly a person who loves going on adventures, and so I'm very excited to talk with Will today. So, Will, it's an honor to have you on Old Bodies Outside.
No, thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's an absolute treat to be here, and I've already enjoyed talking with you before we hit the record button. So I'm sure this is going to be really fun.
Yeah, likewise, likewise. Well, why don't we just take it back to the start of how did you discover adventure therapy? I mean, this is something that I had never really heard about until I actually started getting into academia and whatnot, but I was unaware of it before that.
So really, I grew up with a lot of difficult family context, which is not worth getting into or picking that scab off at all. But when I was about 8 years old, my mom said, why don't you try summer camp? And I thought, no frickin' way am I going to summer camp. And my mom said, you can go to summer camp and your best friend at elementary school is going to go with you. And I said, okay, I'll go with him then. That'll be great. And while driving to the airport to meet my friend to fly from Maryland to Vermont to go to summer camp, I learned that my friend had bailed and he wasn't going. And I cried the whole way to the airport. And then I got on the plane though, and I went to the camp director after my second day there, and I said, can I please call my mom? And he said, well, it's not really policy that, kids can just call their mom whenever they want. And I called her and said, just leave me here and I'll be fine. And if you can extend my stay as long as possible, that will be fantastic. But so much of my summers were spent canoeing on lakes in, the upper Northeast and around New England. And so I've just, the outdoors was always a happy place for me I love canoeing. I love backpacking and hiking. And so as my teenage years were ongoingly difficult, I sat on numerous therapist couches. I say that I was couch surfed around many offices, and I was a good therapy participant, but I also, when I realized you could work in a way that was outdoors, I have to go get a social work degree right now and learn how to do this. It made absolute sense to me, and I never looked back. And a kind of side story to that, when I turned 18, I joined the volunteer fire department in Maryland. And I really I had this idea I wanted to help people, but I didn't really know how I would do that or what that would look like. So I was firefighting. I got my emergency medical technician certificate. And I was working on the ambulance and doing all this stuff. And an opportunity came to teach wilderness search and rescue to at-risk youth. And when I went to the woods and started working with these young people that were removed from home, sent away by their parents, all of this difficult context to figure out, I kind of thought to myself, I'd rather run into a burning building with these kids than half the firefighters that I work with. And I saw these young people who I think were very similar to me, but I saw them at their best. I didn't see the problems that these big files were sent to us with all the referral information and how messed up their family context was. I didn't see any of that. And it sort of just resonated with me that that's who I was at summer camp. I was a stellar camper, but this horrible school student. And I went, maybe we can find clues about people and give them these wonderful experiences in the outdoors. Um, and I also think there was something very real about sleeping under the stars. I mean, it sounds awkward to say sleeping with your clients. I don't mean it like that, but being just out there in the rain, in the mud, amongst the wild all together. I think there's something very brave as a clinician to be out there with your clients. Like there's no space to be fake will when you're out there. It's all for real. So there was something that was much less um, something that was much more real than the counseling room for me. And so, in one essence, yes, I push my hobbies onto my clients, but the other side is I think they get a better me as the therapist with that as well.
Yeah, it sounds like sleeping under the stars out there, hanging out every single second. I mean, you can't get away from them. It seems authentic. It seems sincere.
Yeah, and when you go back to, and not to get into the weeds of how does therapy work, but you go back to Carl Rogers and these core conditions, what is actually necessary for therapy to work? Experiencing your therapist as a genuine person is very important. And that relationship, whether it's inside or outside, has to feel real. And it has to be an emotionally charged, real relationship and I work with teenagers. This stuff works with all different clientele, but teenagers are amazingly awesome at smelling bullcrap. And so they will smell you out in a second if you're not real and authentic. So in there's also a big part of it that's kind of a challenge for the worker to be real and there and authentic. That whole experience is also it puts a big amount of pressure on us to be good practitioners.
Yeah, yeah. So what's the longest you've been out on an adventure therapy trip, and with doing everything that goes into it with adventuring, but also the therapy, helping with well-being. I mean, does it take? Do you come back exhausted and just like, but gratified, exhausted?
Yeah, so the longest I've been at is 50 to 60 days on a
Whoa.
program, and this did end a long-term relationship because I'm never exhausted when I'm out there. So I was working 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and someone got sick, and I picked up all their shifts on the 2 weeks off that I was supposed to
Wow.
have. You can see that putting quite a strain on a young relationship. But it's I I go back to this idea of kind of summer camp and funny context. We teach social work intensives at our university here in Australia. So we have 200 students around for 2 weeks at a time. And I just got back from one of these 2 weeks ago. And all the staff were saying, "Aren't you exhausted?" And I just went, "No, this is awesome. I love being on campus, having people around, and this vibrant sort of community, and going out and seeing the town with all these wonderful people. It's amazing. When I get home, yes, I am exhausted, and it doesn't hit me until I actually turn off. Um, but a funny thing about that, about turning off with our program, we built in sort of, we're on expedition for 2 weeks, and we built in a visit to a beach house at the end of it. So kind of mimicking coming home. So we're kind of in a urban-ish environment, and all the staff turn off too. Everybody turns off because it's like we're not on anymore. So it's actually a great thing to consider how we actually return from wonderful experiences in the outdoors. How do we transition that learning back to the home environment? Because we can switch off, which our brain is probably telling us to do, but also have we really integrated that experience back to a more normal, whatever that means, living environment? So I do get exhausted, but only when I get home, and that's where having supportive family that know you don't want to talk about that whole experience again for at least 2 days, so you can really unpack and sit there and not talk and not be in the spotlight, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I gotta say, when I go, I'll go out and do like say 10 nights of backpacking, I have a hard time transitioning back to um, my day-to-day rhythms actually, and like just like all the interactions I have. I've been out with solitude. I've been out in solitude. I've had a good escape, or I've been with one other person. But I always have a hard time transitioning back, and it actually takes me. I'm not like maybe exhausted because I've been pouring in and helping people, but I'm more so I have a hard time transitioning. But whatever about that, I actually also wanted to share. I don't know
Hmm.
how familiar you are with summer camps around the summer. But starting off with about your story about going to summer camp just got me really excited. So my
Hmm.
wife and I are doing something new this summer. Um, last 2 summers, we sent our kids to Camp Birchwood up in northern Minnesota, and they did 2 week stints. And last summer we picked them up and they loved it to the point that we live about 8 hours from the drop off point, and they were crying on the way home because they had such a good time. They
Hmm.
wanted to stay. So this summer, our kids who are 11 and 12 are going to be going out doing a month-long camp trip up in northern Minnesota. And we just signed some paperwork for my stepson to canoe into Canada and go camp for the night in
Wow.
Canada. And oh gosh, I'm like, man, I wish I did that when I was your age.
I I know. I look back at summer camp and I just think what a treat of an experience that I got. And I'm so I remember that car ride to the airport and my tears going, I'm not going to know anybody here and this is going to be terrible. And I'm just so grateful that my mom that she stuck with it to let me go because I went for 2 weeks my first time. I got it extended till 3, so that was the end of the camp season, and I went 8 weeks every year the rest of
Whoa!
when I was old enough to do it. Yeah, and they
Wow,
did
eight
think,
weeks.
and it was so interesting. They did things like um, every week there was a mandatory backpacking or overnight canoeing trip. So we were away Wednesday to Thursday, something like that. And later on in the years, they made that voluntary, and I still did all of them. I was like, I want to go and do that mountain and go do that canoe trip. So there was something, I don't know, in my psychology or my DNA that was always about getting out and going and playing outside and doing something. And yeah, so I think it's just such a wonderful experience that made when I talk in Australia, summer camp is not it's not really part of the culture here. So, and 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 that's probably because it's way too hot in our summer. But I think about um, my expeditions for my work are 2 weeks, and people go, "Wow, that's a really long time." And I always go, "My gosh, this is so short." like, this is not long enough. And so, yeah, it's such an amazing opportunity. And I mean, it's not for everybody, of course, and we don't want to force everyone to have to experience the same thing. But when it lands and it lands well, my gosh, what an opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. No, we're really excited for the kids. We drop them off mid June, and then we'll
Hmm.
see them back in mid July. And oh man, it's I can't wait to drop them off, but I also can't wait to pick them up and hear all
I
about
know.
it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so why don't we hear a little bit more about adventure therapy? I personally don't know much about adventure therapy. I do some research on experiential research on conservation, actually, but I
Hmm.
don't know much about adventure therapy. So, what's adventure therapy about? What is it?
Sure. So, as I said before we hit the record button, this is probably the most contentious question that you could ask me, and I don't want to maintain position of holding the dominant narrative about what is or is not adventure therapy. In essence, I kind of believe that the word adventure before the therapy is not the greatest word. I kind of think the because I think every therapist is an adventure therapist because we meet someone, we have no idea where it's going. That's the adventure. But I
Yeah,
also think it's misleading because if everyone listening closes their eyes and thinks what they think of the word adventure, they're probably going to think whitewater rafting, scaling a cliff, Alex Honnold free soloing El Capitan, all these things that they go, I can't do that. So really, when I think of adventure therapy, what I think is it's a therapy, a psychotherapy of some sort, with some sort of active bodily engagement, with an experiential process. That it can be gardening, it can be surfing. We're seeing a huge rise in surf therapy with veterans, people living with disabilities. We're seeing all these different kind of activity-based therapies. And so adventure doesn't necessarily mean going out to the woods for weeks on end. It can be a walk and talk session in a park. It can be all these different things. So I think it's adventure therapy is a term that I like to think of as a huge circus tent that all of us can get under to talk about something we kind of don't agree on anything about, but we sort of are all together with this kind of idea that maybe getting out and doing something is a good way to work with people, that we don't necessarily have to sit on the couch. And to caveat that about therapy is we're seeing an awesome rise in telehealth, right? And this is a good link to the past 3 years and this sort of pandemic. I don't know if you've heard about that we all went through. That was absolutely horrible.
I've heard of it.
Right? Yeah. So you've got you have this pandemic, and all clinicians around the world were told, okay, you can all work online now. And so there's been regulations and rules internationally about who can work on the phone or by Zoom, all these things. But they were also told, and you can go outside if you want to sit on a park bench, if you want to go for a walk with your client. Now, people have been doing this for decades anyway, but we saw this huge rise in telehealth, and which is great. That's another way to engage people who could benefit from a therapeutic service. Not everyone wants to walk into a clinic. Not everyone wants a 1-hour session. Some people might want a 15-minute phone call. That's awesome. But some people might also want a 6-hour hike, or to sit in a garden with someone, or to play music with someone. I see the guitars behind you. So I think of adventure therapy as not a other than any therapy, but just going outside for the benefit of the therapeutic interaction, and bringing in some active bodily engagement might just be another key to working with people in the mental health space. It doesn't have to be better than or different. It probably is just exactly the same, just a different way to work.
Yeah, well, I like that you talked about that. Get outdoors, have some bodily engagement. And I think starting right there with those two criteria, it seems like there's also just a sense of accomplishment for getting outside and maybe have a little bodily engagement. I mean, that's something that sometimes can be intimidating.
Well, absolutely. And just think, I mean, as two academics here, we can acknowledge that almost all psychotherapy theory is from the neck up. It's all about the brain. It is all about talking. It is about listening. And so think about how much we can change by being a whole body, an embodied experience of therapy. And so you said about, kind of this idea of success and mastery. And this is it's really interesting if you end it, and this is not to get into the weeds of academia, but if you read old outward bound literature, so old outdoor education sort of stuff, it was all about giving people problems to solve. And I don't think we should prescribe problems to people, but giving them tasks that we facilitate in a way that they will succeed at them. And so outward bound literature was all about success and mastery. Now, what's interesting is we've kind of forgotten where that term came from. In one of the first mention of success and mastery together as a term is at a psychotherapy adolescent conference in the 1930s. So
Wow.
you have this idea of we've got to stop talking about problems and giving young people experiences where they experience success and mastery. So what that lends itself to can be problematic. Do you have to successfully rock climb to the top of the climb? No. If you say no, that's enough. Can the facilitator actually facilitate a conversation with the client about what was it like to say no? What was it like to have a sense of agency? And so you can, if the idea is about success and mastery, you can do that anywhere. And so a lot of old school psychotherapy research from the 60s is you can give people problem solving tasks that they succeed at that have nothing to do with the problem that brought them to therapy, and it can actually increase their sense of agency, their sense of self-control. And so that can lead them to feel energized to solve many of the issues that brought them to therapy in the first place. So I think the outdoors is kind of the outdoor therapy session, the adventure is really just the metaphor for the client being their best, and then they can apply that how they want to their life outside of the therapy session.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. And um, you got me thinking about, and this is probably a word that, well, it's two words that comes up maybe in adventure therapy. I don't know. But I was
Sure.
thinking of self efficacy. And
Sure.
like the success and mastery, wasn't that studied by like a scientist named Bandera or something like that? I don't know if
Yes.
that rings a bell.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we think of self-efficacy, it's really interesting. And you brought up the solution-focused book that I wrote with my dear friend Stefan, and he was talking about this notion of as we're kind of solution focused is ingrained in us. I don't think it's better than anything else. It's just the way I think about things. One of the things we do in solution focused therapy, classic. So imagine client comes in, sits on the couch, is we might ask them about exceptions to the problem, about, when was a time you had the urge to self-harm but you didn't, when was a time you noticed yourself getting angry but you kind of did some regulation. So you're trying to find solutions the client already has. In the outdoors, one of the things Stefan taught me, and I love this so much, is what if your session is an exception to the problem? What if you give your client problem free time? Then you have so much evidence when the client says, I got too angry, or I was in a really dark place over the week before I saw you again. You have all this evidence of, but they did have a time with you that you saw them be at their best. And so when you can keep showing the client all their capabilities and resources and everything that makes them so wonderful, you it becomes this wonderful way to work with people, that you don't have to be interested in all their limitations. We call these the killer D's. They're disabilities, diagnosis, disorders, deficiencies, deficits, and we can see all these things that make them so capable, because at the end of the day, no one's actively trying to make their life worse. So it's amazing to work with people this way. And I think that mindset lets people from all different backgrounds be seen, and doing things together in a very real way. Of course, no therapist in the world can reduce the power differential of I'm the helper, someone else is the helped. We'll never get rid of that. But at the same time, doing things together where they can see how you react when you get rained on, and then we can see how they react when they get rained on. And an example I use all the time is, you know, we don't bring a match or a lighter out into the field when we're out in the woods. And I see young people who are referred for ADHD. They have no patience. They are terror in the classroom. They don't sit still. They're constantly tapping. I am just describing myself entirely. And they sit in the rain and spark a fire for an hour. And they just sit there and keep going. And you go, here's evidence that we can help set up a scenario where they do sit still and they do all these things that we describe as problematic, and I've watched them do it. So sometimes when whether it's outdoors or in a dance studio or in a recording studio with a guitar, in a garden, any of these places, we should really be thinking about how can we make the counseling setting a place for people to be their best. So that means a place that's a safe place, but also a brave place where they can explore themselves and be out there and be wild and be, you know, to be out there, putting themselves out there. So I think the space that the outdoors has, and I'm I feel like I'm doing a sales pitch, but that's where I think I see the best of my clients.
Yeah, and helping them be their best self. Like I liked how earlier you talked about with rock climbing. If they have the agency to say, hey, like like I don't need to go to the top to do that. Like I can give it a try or whatever. But
Mm.
having the ability to have some agency and have some confidence in your agency. But I like that there's not just like the simplistic approach of let's get after this problem, let's get after this problem. Let's help you be your best self. It seems more holistic.
Oh, totally. And it's something I'm constantly. ev- ev- my wife will say this. Everyone that's worked with me will say this, that I always need a logistics manager because I'm constantly creating new ideas of how to adapt our program, and then nothing will get done because I just sit in the creative thinking of overthinking this stuff. Um, but it's so interesting. Like you think about rock climbing, and so we will take young people to a high ropes course. It's really fun. It's easy. It's pretty self-directed. But some people don't want to be off the ground. It's scary. Heights are scary no matter what anyone says. That's why we wear harnesses. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
brutal regardless. So you you take people, and then when someone says no, what happens in so much classic adventure programming is there's nothing else for that client to do. So they have to sit while everyone else looks like they're having fun on a high ropes course climbing this and that. So one of the things we started doing is we started saying with one of my staff, Catherine, she's amazing, and she's an incredible climber, and she would say to the group, I don't really like heights, so I'll sit over here and I've got all this nature art stuff activities to do. So if no one wants to climb, you don't have to. And you make that choice so available that clients can, with dignity, say no to something. Where quite often, if it's in the program and it's scheduled, what tends to happen is if you say no, you either get coerced into participating or you have to sit and be the loner outside of the group not participating. So giving clients choice, and I'll get a little bit into the weeds of like trauma and this sort of stuff, that if trauma is something that happens when someone's agency and choice was taken away from them, how different is it to make therapy an arena for people to make dignified choices and be be um, uh, be privileged to make that choice. So it's so funny that just thinking about success and mastery, I think, isn't about actually succeeding or mastering anything. It's about the mastery within oneself, that we can feel that we have the ability to overcome some adversity that we experience. And so, yeah, I think it's so, yeah, doing things together has this wonderful opportunity to really observe your client, but also to help facilitate that experience. And I'll say a funny story about this. I was teaching last night, and so I went to Norway, and I got to be a participant observer on a wilderness therapy program there. So these were young people who showed up at the hospital, and the hospital said, we can do talk therapy or you can go to the woods. And most choose talk therapy. These ones chose the woods. So we're out on a week-long expedition, and one day the leader wakes up and says, who would like to hike today and who would like to stay at camp? And I thought, who the heck is going to want to go hiking when the opportunity is, you also being afforded the opportunity not to go hiking. And I said I would like to see snow. I had done a big chunk of time in Australia, and so I hadn't seen snow in a while. And it was summer in Norway, and there was still snow on top of the mountains. And it was me, the female participants, and a female social worker, and off we went. All the males stayed at camp. So we head up this mountain, and we're just hiking slowly. We stop for lunch. We eat some chocolate. We're having fun and joking around. We got to snow. We're throwing snowballs at each other. It was so fun. And this one participant, she said, I don't want to hike anymore. I'm ready to go back to camp. And I said, no problem. I will take you back to camp. That's absolutely cool. And the other participants went on hiking up the mountain. They wanted to reach the summit. And I could sense this a little bit of apprehension. And I said, you sure you're ready to go back to camp? And she said to me, well, I just feel like a burden. I'm too slow. I'm too out of shape. I'm slowing down the group. And here I am in Norway, a country where I do not speak the native language, and they all speak English better than I do. And I have no map, no compass, no first aid kit, no phone service, nothing that would be good outdoor practice. All I can see is down a valley and see where our campfire is. That's all I got. And I said, well, screw that. We can just hike at our own pace. And I said, why don't we just set my timer for 10 minutes and we'll see what happens. So we snoozed that for 2 hours as we kept climbing this mountain at her pace. And we turned around and there was a rainbow beneath us over the valley. And it was just this wonderful experience. And she said in group around the fire group therapy time that night, she said, it was so important. I'd never been around a male who didn't try to tell me how to be and what to do.
Oh.
Which is really powerful. I had no clinical, what's the word here? I wasn't I was a researcher. I was just there to be a part of a group. I wasn't the clinician. I wasn't trying. I had no vested interest in the outcome professionally. Of course, being with a group of young people, everyone's working for their best interest. But what I thought when I reflect on that experience is how much we can overthink therapy and how much when we really, really focus on what is the client experiencing in our work, the adventure was what she said around the fire that night. The adventure was this whole idea of what a man is, how men can interact with this person, how she can safely interact with nice people in a safe place where I was feeling the whole time, I don't have a first aid kit. I don't have a phone. What happens when this goes horrible? I'm alone with a female client. That's a big no-no. A lot of times I'm sitting there going, oh, this is terrible. And she's thinking the exact opposite to me. And it wouldn't have happened if I could have put the stop on that experience. So it's kind of the adventure is really just being out there with your client and really giving them the chance to make meaning from that experience of what that feels like. So I think it's amazing that that experience of success and mastery and making meaning from the experience of being outdoors. And then you add all the benefits of how people can, stress reduction, restoration, all these things that just can naturally happen from being outside. So I went on a tangent with that story. Sorry.
Oh, Bill, that was fantastic. And, I love that with that story, the compassion that was brought and the avoidance of introducing your own personal agenda. Because I think that would have just, gone right back to how she had perceived being around males and men. But I think that, bringing that level of compassion, allowing people to be themselves and be comfortable being themselves and to experience that's got to be huge.
Well, absolutely. And it's interesting when you get into the therapy mindset. I added this story in my PhD thesis. And one of my reviewers said, I think you should have explored the feeling of feeling like a burden. And I went, why would we want to make that story larger? Like, people feel like burdens all the time. Like, it happens, it's normal life. We don't need to pathologize what this person was experiencing and instead give them this wonderful experience that is, I'll say this a different way. we live in trauma-informed times, right? And so we're talking about trauma a lot. It's on the news. If trauma is an experience that happens to someone, and how the body reacts to these harmful experiences where choice was taken away, where their world is unpredictable, where they're not seen and they're not taken care of, shouldn't our work be the exact opposite of that? Where people have choice, where people feel safe, where people have positive experiences. So if negative experiences can harm people, I think our work has to be positive experiences. And part of that involves a little bit of bravery. And we think of this like navigating with a map and compass at night. We have to be willing to embrace the unknown of what happens when we give clients a sense of control, a sense of agency. When we give that to them and they can make choices, we have to embrace what happens when a client says, no, I don't want to do that. We have to be prepared for these things, but also be prepared for letting go of the experience so that the client can really have that sense of experience. And I'll give another kind of old school example of this. We have these ideas of broad adventure, narrow adventure. Skydiving is a serious adventure, but for the most part, the first time people do this, you're strapped to the person who has all the control. So it's a narrow adventure. You don't actually get any mastery from skydiving. But except for, are you really sure you want to jump out of this airplane? Which, I'm a nervous flyer. I'm sure that's horrifying. Broad adventure is like paddling a canoe. Eventually, you have to figure out how to paddle a canoe because you're going to go in circles and it's going to be frustrating, and you and your canoe partner are going to want to beat each other up. It's horrible. So we can let go of the sense of this narrow adventure by just continuing to hike the mountain at that client's pace, laughing, doing it 10 minutes at a time, and letting that client say, 10 more minutes. Great, no worries. That was broad adventure. It doesn't have to be dangling from a harness. It can just be mastering something that we kind of think is also very easy. But when we're the guide, what's easy for us is not easy to define what's easy for another person.
Yeah.
So I love that experience. To me, I just think it is the personification of broad adventure, that here we are on top of this mountain. And one of the most amazing things she did, she pulled out her phone and started playing Christian music. Now, I am not a religious person. I think I've stepped inside a church 3 times in my life. And I said, what are you doing? Like, in my mind, I was like, what's going on here? And she said, Will, this is my church. As we sat on a snowbank with a rainbow beneath us and this beautiful lake, and I went, oh my gosh. So all these things that are inside of this client all came out in this one experience. Spirituality, a relationship with an older male that she hadn't experienced. All of these things came out, and I think it's so incredible how that can happen.
Yeah. What a cathedral you're all at, and just all
Yeah,
those
exactly. Yeah.
all those things that she experienced. Now,
Mm.
I was thinking about maybe someone that is an adolescent coming through one of these programs, and you're thinking of this broad adventure aspect with them,
Hmm.
like
Right.
canoeing. But what about like if it's someone that's really there against all their willpower? They're kind of forced in the situation by parents or something like that, and they're going to
Yeah.
be possibly in this example they're very stubborn and whatnot. And I would think
Hmm.
having that broad adventure kind of thinking would actually help someone like that to kind of start with some baby steps or even half baby steps, and then make that a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. Maybe that'd help. I mean, I don't know what I'm talking about necessarily, but I
That's
was just
okay.
thinking about if there was a very stubborn aspect, and you're really trying to help this person out. How does that look?
So we when it comes to working with teenagers, and again, not all this work is teenager centric, but but I tend to be. You, we do have a problem in the world of adventure therapy, and we see this. I mean, Paris Hilton was just on the Capitol building front lawn in Washington, D.C., talking about the stopping child abuse in residential treatment. And so we do have a problem of using the outdoors as the jail, as going, well, we'll just get them outside, and then they can't use drugs, they can't have their phones, they don't have negative influencing friends, and then they'll get better. And this, I find this highly problematic in our field, because as a teenager myself, I never went to my mom and said, Mom, I'd really like to go see another therapist. Thanks. Can it please be an outdoor one? That never happened. So I think part of it is when it comes to any person, because we think of involuntary clients meaning that the judge sent them, or that the courts have said you have to go do this, or a boss saying you need to go to therapy or you're going to lose your job. So, but there's involuntary clients everywhere. I'm thinking of like a couple, and one partner says to the other, you need to go get help and stop drinking. That person doesn't think they have a problem per se, and they go and they're reluctant. So this happens all the time with all ages. One of the things with teenagers is, and I actually think this with all clients, the first thing we do when we go to, and I'll say this in kind of a sarcastic way, when we go to a restaurant, we walk in the door, and the maitre d', the head of house, the front staff, whatever we call them, says, how can I help you? And you say, I'm hungry, I'd like a table for two. And they say, how hungry are you? Is this hunger related to your mother? Is this related to some trauma we do this lengthy assessment. No restaurant on earth does that. They say, what do you want? Here are the choices. What do you want? So with young people, sitting down with them and avoiding these boring, lengthy assessments. I mean, we even call it an intake. It's a taking from the client, right? It's not even a giving. There's no giving from session one. And I know this sounds like hyperbole, but get this. In Australia, we have a national mental health use service. It's well funded. It's everywhere in all these small towns. It's kind of like McDonald's. They plop these centers into all these communities, even, indigenous communities where this, like with no indigenous consultation. Thousands of kids come through these services, and the average, most common number of sessions that young people attend is one, because they show up and they don't get anything that they think they want. So quite often, the first session, especially with young people, has to be a performance. You have to swear a little. You have to come across like you're not their parents. You have to come across like you're a different adult. Teenagers are biologically and evolutionarily trying to leave their parents. They're leaving the nest. They're learning how to fly. And if they don't have good adults around them, when they feel disconnected from parents, aunts, uncles, school teachers, sports coaches, all these things, when they get disconnected, they'll find the easiest place to find connection, which is often the drug community. The bar of entry is very low into feeling connected in that group. But so we want to hold on to our kids and keep them connected to other adults. And so other people that they can feel safe to talk to. And sometimes that can be a therapist. I don't think it has to be. It can be anybody. And you see a lot of young people in residential treatment, children removed for child protection reasons from their home. A lot of times the people they get most connected with are like the cleaner, the landscaper, because those people tend to connect with people with no agenda, where therapists want things to change. So we have to start with this mindset of connection way before correction. So the faster we move as the worker, the more we leave the other person behind at the starting line. So, and this is really hard in substance use kind of stuff, because we get told the substance is the problem. And so a kind of, and I worked with a father about this. He came, he said, I have to, my drinking is getting in the way of how I'm raising my kids. And my wife is, my partner is really hating my drinking, and I just can't stop. And I said, well, what's the goal here? Is it just stopping this behavior? And he said, I want to be a good father. And then we started talking about what that looks like, really describing what does it mean to be a good father? How will you know you're a good father? What will your partner think of you as a good father? What will your kids notice? What will your dog notice? What will your friends notice? And it became less about this problem that he walked through the door with and all about what he wanted from the interaction. So young people are I mean, we write about them like they're the hardest people to work with, but I really do believe we just haven't actually, we've taken these adult ideas and sort of gone, let's just apply this to teenagers. Um, so I think things like moving around and thinking about how can we make some of the things that teenagers naturally do into these really fun, engaging ways, and then the thinking about the ways that they can think this through, like even talking about leadership instead of emotional skills, just changing the language a little bit to make it not sort of that we always are living on planet mental health, that we're just being good people with each other, and that sort of stuff. So um, teenagers are difficult, but I think the people I find that are so good at it are the ones that are really open and not trying to hold on to um, keeping that teenager in the box, but letting us see them how wonderful they can be.
Gosh, Will, that was an amazing explanation, and it really made a lot of sense to me. But at the same time, I was thinking, like, how long did it take you to start really kind of seeing effective methods to work with young adult or young people? I mean, how often did you have some failures, and you're like, okay, I need to adapt, I need to adapt, I need to adapt. I mean, maybe that still happens, like, because every person is
Oh
unique.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think practitioners not talking about their failures is one of it's a huge shortcoming in our field that I think and even though I highly recommend everyone keep listening to this podcast, an amazing podcast started by two marriage family therapy students when they were studying their master's degree, called the Very Bad Therapy Podcast with Ben and Carrie. Incredible, hilarious. All they had to do was put out the feelers of, hey, who's had a bad therapy experience? And the funny thing is, there's some that are egregious, right? Like, you know, changing the price of therapy without telling the client, like all these things that are horrible. But often, a lot of the things that go wrong is like, therapist took his shoes off and put his shoes on the couch, like with stinky socks. And it, like, you know what I mean? It's like a lot of it's really hilarious if we actually open it up and can talk about it. But yeah, I mean, I really believe, and I have a story about this that I had a client I was working with a few years ago, and there is some early onset psychosis, and that is not my wheelhouse. And I was just uh, I was getting very into outcome monitoring, which is, this is feedback informed treatment. It's very nerdy. We don't have to go into it. But I was monitoring every session with a very easy outcome measure. Just like every time we go to the doctor, they take our blood pressure. You need a simple tool to figure out, is there something actually really going wrong here? And the client was telling me he's loving our sessions, but I'm watching this outcome rating slowly go down. And the mother was a mental health nurse, and I called her and said, I think we need to try something different. I'm not being effective here, even though he came every session. And what the data shows, which is really interesting, is by about session 3, if the client isn't experiencing, and this is their subjective experience, if they aren't experiencing benefit from the therapy, it's about 90% unlikely to happen from session 3. So think
Wow.
about how long and that doesn't mean therapy can't help you. It means it's time for that clinician to take charge and make changes. So what I sat with this young guy and his mom, and I said, I think what we should do is try a different worker. And he was rightfully upset. He said, but I like seeing you. I said, you can always come back. It's just I really want to make sure this is useful. So I sent him to my friend Aaron, who is the exact opposite to me. Suit and tie, psychology clinic. I heard him tell a 14-year-old once that he was experiencing an emotional dichotomy. And I said, Aaron, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know what this even means. The exact opposite clinician to me. And this young person loved it. And it was this huge, great outcome. And the mother, I wrote about this in the Solution Focus book. I did change it because this is sort of funny Australian culture. But the mother, I wrote that the mother sent me native flowers because I was like, I've got to make this right. I come home one day and there's a carton of beer on my front steps. And this is months later. And she said, basically, thank you for saving my child's life.
Wow.
And I get emotional with the story. But the thing is, all I did was get out of the way. And I realized when I wasn't being helpful, and I tried to get that person to someone else. And oddly enough, that mother was my biggest source of referrals in my organization. And she kept doing it even when I failed with her son. And because it wasn't a failure, it was, we try to call that like failing successfully. So if we're all open and honest about who we're not being effective with, instead of going, this is my client, we can start sharing. And Aaron and I share clients all the time, and we continue to do so. So it's one of those amazing things that we can actually, if we have that culture of being open and honest and transparent with each other, we don't have to be the best. In fact, if we really are honest with ourselves, being bad at our job is how we learn how to get better. But we have to acknowledge being bad at it at times.
So do you, if you had to characterize an effective adventure therapist, would it be the open, honest, transparent, humble, adaptive?
Absolutely. Because there's the side of it, we need technical skill. We got to know how to tie knots and how to camp and how to keep people safe and dry outside. But I also think one of the greatest characteristics is the ability to adapt to who we're working with. And good outdoors, like it's so funny, all these metaphors. Good outdoors people do this all the time when they're camping. Oh, it's raining. I'll put on my raincoat and rain pants and boots to stay dry. We have to have that mindset when we're doing the therapy. So this is the danger of the trend of manualizing everything. This is what the government wants. They want to know they're paying for therapy that's effective, that has a playbook, but people aren't a playbook. So when we have a manual, and I think this is such an important metaphor for teaching and therapy, that if you have a manual, your offensive playbook, here's how I'm going to approach the classroom today. Here's how I'm going to approach my client. When they say this isn't working, we just flip the page to a different playbook. But what we're doing is we're starting from, we already know what we need to do before meeting the person, where really figuring out what this person wants and tailoring it is really what the adventure is all about, which is why I kind of started this with anyone who sits on a therapist's couch is going on an adventure of their own, as is that therapist.
Yeah. That's really amazing stuff. And you got me thinking about, so this past weekend I went and saw the movie Air. And I don't know if you're familiar with that at all.
Yeah. I saw it a few weeks ago. Yeah.
Okay. So do you remember the scene in it where he's talking about Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and they're talking about how halfway through he was like, man, it's just not hitting with the crowd, and like he just like did a pivot mid speech, and he had the structure of his speech going into it, and he just saw it wasn't working, and he adapted right there on the spot and then put it together. I Have a Dream. And then Sonny, the main character in the movie, when he's talking to Michael Jordan for the first time at Nike headquarters, he's assessing. He could tell that the purpose that they're trying to deliver is just not hitting with the Jordans, not mom, not dad, not Michael. And then Sonny, gets into it. It's like, man, like you're going to be a player that's so good. Your name's going to be known for
Mm.
eternity, and that adaptability right there. And but while like really critically assessing to see like if the delivery is hitting or not. You got me thinking about that with the adaptability. Totally
No,
get into the weeds and whatnot.
I have an interesting story about this. I was working about 2 hours south of Adelaide in this town called Victor Harbor, which is it's a retirement area, but it used to have industry. So you have retired population and unemployed young people. So lots of serious meth use. It's a really odd, kind of difficult place. And so I was down there working at this alternative school, and I've got this young woman client in front of me, and she's saying, "I don't want to be here." And we're sitting on these old couches, and it is. I filmed all my sessions for 2 years, and by the way, speaking of a humbling experience, watch yourself work. It's horrible, and
Will,
and I have this.
I don't even
Yeah,
listen to my own podcast because like I know you can learn from it, but like sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to hear myself talk.
no, it's horrible, isn't it?
It
And so I'm
is.
sitting. I have this session filmed, and I'm sitting with this guy. It's these horrible old couches in a room without a window, and I'm sitting there, and she's looking at me, going, "I don't want to do this. I've tried this before. I don't want to do this." And I'm going, "Well, let's try to figure out if we can do something different." And she goes, "No, I don't know why the principal's asking me to see you." It's like 30 minutes of excruciatingly bad therapy, right? It's horrible. And I said to her, okay, well, anyway, let's not talk about any of this. Like, what are things like when you feel somewhat okay? She's telling me how depressed she is, and she had horrific trauma. It was horrible. And she said, well, I know this guy, and he's teaching me to play the drums. Now, I am a drummer. My drum set is right there. I am a good drummer. And I said, oh, can we go play drums? And she said, I guess. And we went. I would play guitar. She would play drums. That's what we did 1 hour every week. She was school captain in like the head of the school in 6 months. I don't think I did anything, but I was open to not forcing her to sit on the couch and talk to me. And
Right.
a really great story of this young person. I love this. I woke up one day. I was about to start my drive down there. I was doing weekly consultation at the school, and I put on this Hawaiian shirt. And my wife said, "Why are you wearing that?" And I said, "Well, I just thought I'd look different today, like at the school, like stand out, be goofy." And she was like, "You're an idiot," as usual. I was like, "Yeah, I know." So I go to the school, and this client comes up to me. This is like a year later, right? She comes up to me and she goes, "Oh my gosh, I knew you knew it was Idaho Day, International Day Against Homophobia." And I said, "Oh yeah, I totally over my head. I had no idea because because it's not really as big in Australia as it is in America, and Australia's you're always yesterday to me, right? You're Wednesday, I'm Thursday. So I she got money together from the school and bought all these white T-shirts and was spray painting rainbow flags on them and gave a speech to everyone about how important it is to stand up against homophobia. And I was going, who is this person that last year was sitting next to me going, I don't want to do anything. I don't want to. And I go, so it's kind of not really about what we talk about, but if we open up the space for them to really feel like they belong, to feel like they're needed. And that's with youth, that's one of the hardest things is that often many our approaches to help them communicates that we don't love them. And instead, what if we communicate, you have a whole world that you're growing into that you have the ability to change, that you have the ability to make small change, big change, any change. And that's for you to decide. You're going to be the tool to make that world what it is. So I think a lot of times when we are open to, we don't have to do a certain empirically supported treatment for every mental health diagnosis because all of us know someone with an ADHD diagnosis, with a depression diagnosis. And we also know that when we look at them as a person, there's no two sunsets that are exactly the same, and there's no two diagnoses that actually capture what this person, what their lived experience really is. And there's a wonderful quote from this book called Connect. It came out a few years ago, and the quote is something like, the real way to connect is to acknowledge that I have no idea what you're actually going through and what you're actually experiencing. And when I approach you from not knowing, I can be really amazed in who you are and what you're going through by what I listen to. So I think, like you said in the movie Air, being able to go, oh my gosh, this is failing and changing is better. And in that ways, many times when we meet clients as a therapist, it's like a first date. It's incredibly awkward. And when you're working with a young person, they don't want to be there anyway. So it's like a blind date with someone who doesn't want to sit and talk to you. So you're really on stage being like, how can I make you actually give a crap about what we're going to do here?
Yeah. But like as you said, acknowledging that there's no way for you to know what they're going through, but I feel like that is fostering the act of sincerely, genuinely seeing them. And there's, I gotta imagine, a lot of young people that have never felt seen. And just the
That,
act of that is huge.
well, we have a funny, I guess this is not funny at all, but we have an interesting, the mental health crisis, the language that we use around it is very interesting. So in health, in the world of like medical health, almost every good health intervention is preventative. We put fluoride in the water to stop tooth decay. We have done an amazing job talking about the harms of smoking cigarettes, and that has led to reductions in smoking cigarettes. So everything has to be preventative. And in mental health, everything is reactionary. It's so in Scandinavia, for instance, I know we haven't talked a lot about the outdoors. In Finland, Norway, Sweden, they all have freedom to roam laws, which is everybody can go outside. You can camp anywhere you want. And so think about how a lot of our park services would think about this. They would say, well, what if they trash the park? Well, if we're teaching people from a young age to go outside and be outside, wouldn't most of the community have a better relationship with the outdoors and not trash the park? And so in Norway, for example, because I've been there a few times, I could be a tourist. I could go out into the woods in the middle of winter. Let's say I'm cross-country skiing and I get stuck in a blizzard and I call for help. I will not pay a cent for search and rescue fees because they want people to benefit from the outdoors and not be scared to go outside.
Nice.
So this is this freedom to roam idea. In mental health, because that's the idea of being preventative about this. Now, back to the point of mental health. In most of the Western countries, the leading cause of disability is depression, because we define disability as not going to work, not able to work. So the way we approach mental health is to get the person back to the factory, get them back to work. So hence, what's the easiest way to do that? Medication. I'm not anti or pro medication. I'm absolutely an advocate for what works for whoever. I don't have a judgment either way. With young people, almost all their diagnoses come from what to how they're not fitting in to the mainstream culture. They don't sit still in the classroom, ADHD. They're not showing up to class, depression. So we're reacting all the time. And this is the prevention, the old kind of metaphor is we're pulling all these kids out of the water, but we're not at all talking about why they're getting thrown in. So we're a lot of times, so you have young people in mainstream school misbehaving, acting out, not fitting in, but maybe loving music class. And we're not going, let's do more of what works. instead of more of what isn't working. And a really funny example of this, speaking of feeling like a therapist that's a failure, first expedition we ran with True North, I managed to swing 3 kids on this trip, 3 young boys. Me, outdoor adventure guide, 3 kids. And I went, oh, this is a failure. I'm not going to make any money. And this is horrible. And my business isn't sustainable. And we failed for the first time. It was amazing. It was so fun. It felt like we were all on fire. It was wild. It was so good. And 2 weeks later, the mother of the first kid ever referred to us, the mother rings me and she says, Will, I'm in Italy for a work trip. Can you please go to a school meeting about her son? And I said, oh my gosh. So I'm sitting in this meeting, kid comes in, sits down next to me, and I said, what the heck is the problem? We're supposed to be like, this program works. Why am I in front of your principal right now? Like, and I get triggered whenever I walk in a high school, I get triggered. I'm like, huh, this is horrible, you know? So, which is funny because now I work for university. I work for a different type of education institution. So principal comes in and says, Will, I'm glad he had such a good time camping with you. And I was like, wow, this is really condescending. And he says, but we've had 15 behavior complaints in the last 2 weeks. And I look at the kid, I was like, what the heck? Like, we just worked on some stuff. You're already in trouble 15 times. They were all uniform violations. I was like, oh my God. I was like, I'm really here talking about uniform violations. 2 weeks after that, the kid calls me and goes, yeah, I'm not going to go to high school anymore. And I said, no. You have to go to high school. He goes, nah, I'm going to go work at the snowfields in Australia, which is not great mountains, of course. And I was like, oh my gosh. So the first kid ever referred to my private practice, has dropped out of high school in a month of meeting me. I was like, this is horrible. He's the leading coach for Australians Winter Olympic youth
No
snowboard
way.
team. And we were all trying to cram him into high school. I believe everyone should probably complete high school. I'm not like pro drop out if you don't like it. That's not but he also really knew what he was going to do. So he travels the world with a group of like 10 to 13-year-olds teaching their high school stuff and snowboarding every day.
Love it.
And he's come back and done our expeditions as a mentor and guide as well. And I go, look at this amazing outcome that actually had nothing to do with adventure, that had nothing to do with our work, but it was always in him to make that choice. And I bet, in hindsight, he went back to high school and went, there's no chance in hell I'm ever going to fit in here. And what do you know? That high school tries to promote him in their newsletters. They're star dropout.
That's wild.
But it kind of gets back to this idea of, are we pathologizing and labeling people because they don't fit into the mainstream society, or are we working with people to help them carve their own path to where they feel like they can fit in?
Yeah.
I mean, I know me from Washington, D.C. I mean, I only caught the very tail end of Washington, D.C.'s punk scene, but we have books. I have a whole book about a whole bookshelf on D.C. punk rock, but we have books about women in punk rock, and that is not as calm. It's actually really emerging now, but that kind of alternative scene was incredibly inclusive to everybody and was all about straight edge ethics. Don't kill animals. Don't do drugs. Don't sexually assault people. And, Bad Brains, an amazing hardcore band that was a black punk band. Think of, and this is DC in the 80s. Like I think of like the world that it can be when we embrace what engages young people. They will go find their sense of community. We naturally have we biologically are ingrained to belong and connect, and we can give them great things to connect. But we will fail if we keep homogenizing people into the classroom, into the couch talk therapy, into the medications, into this is how you have to work. And in that sense, I do think there is a bit of a blessing in disguise of what COVID taught us, which was we can actually be really adaptable. Like we will adapt and be strong and make way for everyone to work in different ways. And so I think the outdoors and working with young people in the outdoors is all about embracing that they're going to teach us something that we can't know what we're going to learn.
Yeah. Well, you touched on so much just now. I feel like
Rambler.
you and I can go for another few hours right now.
I
First
know.
off, I need to put you and I into a time machine, and we're going to go back to like April 2019. We're going to
Yep.
go to a geography conference in Washington, D.C. It's called the American Association of Geographers, AAG. And guess who was the guest speaker at this conference to talk about the geographies of punk rock? Ian MacKay.
Ian MacKay. Oh my gosh, that's
It was so
amazing.
cool. It was so cool. He
That
was
is so
talking. He was
cool.
at this geography conference to talk about the geographies of '80s punk rock before there was the internet and before there was a lot of just
Mm,
connections. And so he was like, man, like when we would travel to all these different regions of the country, we saw different takes on punk rock. But what we saw
yeah.
was the general thing that these
Mm,
young people they're engaged. They're carving out their own little area, and they're not like assimilating and being pushed into something they don't want to do, but they're celebrating it in their own way. And it was really cool to
uh,
hear. Really cool to hear.
l-
Another thing
let me
is, go for it. Go for it.
no, let me just something so amazing. I only learned this recently, but a big thing was not having alcohol at shows, at these punk rock shows in the 80s in DC. And that became part of the culture. What's really interesting, you go back to DC in the 80s and 90s, you have the murder capital of the United States.
Mhm.
So, and you have punk rock, which is inherently, people get into punk rock at, middle school. So you have young kids wanting to go to shows, but their parents don't let them out at night. So what happened, and this is all Ian's crew, this is so incredible. They would find venues, any venue, Ethiopian restaurants, anything that would let them have shows during the day. So the bar could stay closed, it could be all ages, and
Nice.
parents would let their kids out. So think like you have this perfect storm of this, at the time, very unsafe city and young people being allowed to go to punk shows. Think about the context of this now. Many venues are 18 plus, let alone 21 plus, but it's an adolescent gig that young people want to go to these shows. And we aren't tailoring to making music venues a safe place for young people, that
Mm,
we can find a way to make a dive bar a safe place for a young person. So instead, they go to the crappiest place, which tends to be the most unsafe,
right.
because we're not bringing the music they're listening to them,
Yeah.
to that place. So it's amazing that the DC punk rock thing emerged, and all these lessons were learned about how to create a vibrant youth community that was safe for people. And they
Amazing.
were talking about animal rights and not drinking and not doing drugs, and in a punk rock community. And then it was safe for youth, and parents supported it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Incredible. But like, parents don't have to like the music youth listen to. None of us like the music our kids listen to. So it's natural. But I think it's so funny that I think about, like, all of this sort of relates to how I think about my work as well. That it has to be so cool for the young person to want to engage, but it can't appear like old guy Will is trying to be cool with the youth, you know, which is why,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, it's going back in time thinking about Minor Threat, and I was just like thinking
Yeah,
like, what was the lyric like? Don't drink, don't smoke, don't fuck. Like,
yeah, 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 exactly. Yeah,
but
it was
go.
all about ethics, all about
Yeah,
ethics.
yeah. But like it's finding a way to let yourself flourish, be seen, and go to a
Mm-hmm.
cool place, and like not being told, like, hey, you got to do it this way. Like, hey, I know how to do stuff. I can do it this way. This is what's
That's
gonna work
right.
best for me.
And it's so funny. I had a conversation with another musician the other day, and he said to me, punk rock is a church, so we all pray at the altar to Ian Mackay, but at the same time, he would hate that, So anyone who says what's punk, what's not, that's acoustic, that's not punk enough, that's not heavy enough, that's not it at all. It's about that community. It's about everyone feeling like they have the place to flourish. And I recorded a record at Inner Ear Studios years ago, which is where Fugazi Monitor, all them recorded. We recorded with Don
Wow.
Zientar. It's an amazing experience. And Ian sold our record. I don't think he sold any of them actually, but he said he would sell them. And I've sat in a lawn and just talked with that guy about our
Really?
stupid pop punk band, and like it was like, here's the godfather of punk music in my city talking to me, this 19-year-old who just recorded a crappy punk record. So
So
it's like,
cool.
it's so funny. It's not about do you fit in, do you not. It's really about, here's an entry into a nice place. And anyone who's going to DC, during the summer, and I might date myself with if this still happens, I believe it does, in DC, summertime, outdoors, in Tenleytown, there's a place called Fort Reno. And Ian and his crew, they put on a free show every Wednesday night during the summer outside. And you will see 4-year-olds, you will see 80-year-olds, you will see everyone. You won't see broken glass, broken bottles. It is all about this community coming together and cherishing independent music. And I just love that it's outside, not in a venue. You don't pay any money. You just show up and watch some music with your community,
Yeah, with your
and you'll see people
community.
from all backgrounds, all this and that. And I just go, this is what punk rock is all about. Is you
Yeah.
know sticking it to the man and bringing it out to everyone, no matter what.
Yeah. Oh, it's got that mindset behind it. You got me thinking
Mm,
about when Rancid released the album and Out Come the Wolves, and there were so many people being like,
oh yeah,
"That's not punk rock. That's not punk rock,"
yeah,
and like,
yeah.
it's freaking Rancid.
I know. Yeah, there's a mohawk on the cover, people.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. So I get away from the punk rock
Yes.
digression here.
Sorry.
I gotta wrap stuff up here. It's getting to be about
Yes.
past 7 p.m. at my house. We gotta do some dinner, but man, so I live in the state of Kansas, and I'm part of a program here called Park Management and Conservation. We're always looking to get our students outside, go have some fun
Nice.
and whatnot. And one of the things that we really
Mm,
struggle with a lot is we're an agriculture state. And what I mean by that is 98% of our land is private land. So we only have 2% of public land. And we got
right.
pockets of state parks here and there, but they're small pockets, but plenty of space to still use. But going back to that freedom to roam thing,
Hmm.
man, like I wish like we could chop some barbed wire up, which would release the people's cows, which isn't fair, but it would be nice to chop up some barbed wire and have some freedom to roam around Kansas.
Like, well, I went to a conference in DeKalb, I don't know how to say it, Illinois. That's where barbed wire was invented, oddly
Hmm.
enough. And we had this adventure therapy conference. And I'm always amazed from, I've spent, we didn't really touch on this, but I've spent some time working and volunteering on indigenous land. Well, everything in Australia is indigenous lands, but in their communities. And I've been Greenland, northern Canada, uh, you know, with Lakota populations in the U.S. And across Australia with Aboriginal peoples. And barbed wire is such a sad metaphor for our lands, and it's a metaphor of how we've created boxes on people's homes that didn't have fenced in places. And I the funny I mean it's so hard to change something when it hasn't. It's so hard to work backwards from fencing, right? Because you go, What's going to get out if we cut these fences? In Norway, we're sitting at a campsite and you hear bells because people's sheep are just roaming the wilderness. And you go,
Wow.
there's no fencing of these animals. It's remarkable. But I think it starts with young people and taking, I think the more fun experiences people have outside at a younger age, the less likely they are to be the people that leave broken glass and beer bottles and cigarette butts and their trash bags and these things that the park services are scared about happening. Um, Also, health insurance in the U.S. and the price of medical interventions scare that also is a limitation to people going outside. They're nervous about getting injured, not being able to go to work, getting injured, getting landed with a tens of $1,000 medical bill. But it's a shame because I think there's a lot of research, and you'd probably know more about this than I, that the the connection to the natural world and the outdoor environment reduces people's climate anxiety. It improves their ability to want to act and take care of the wonderful world that we get to live on, and to make it a better place for us to live on. I think the hardest part about what's going on with the climate is we're not going to really see it as much as the island indigenous nations off of New Zealand are going to see it, that
Yeah.
Southeast Asia is going to see it. All these places that we don't have to think about in when we're in the Western world, that the global South is going to be hit by this way before Australia. And I mean, Australia, we're seeing it. We have horrible flooding. We had horrible flooding this year, hundreds of miles away from me, but that river comes down and empties out into the ocean. And eventually, when all the flooding came out, it emptied out like millions and millions of freshwater fish into the
Mm.
ocean, dead. Now we have beaches covered in dead fish. Like this, and we had the horrible fires. And what's ironic, Australia's always had horrible fires. It's dry and hot here. But the many indigenous cultures here took care to do controlled burns. They would burn it before everything burnt out of control to make sure it was a flourishing forest.
Right.
So I think in a lot of sense we can learn about leave no trace and these important ethics about the outdoors, but I also think engaging with our indigenous communities all around us can teach us about what it actually means to have a nature kinship, that we don't have to go out and dominate the mountain or climb the rock. We can actually think about, I'll show you in this video, I've got this huge if you can see out there, I've got this huge gum tree right there, right?
Yeah.
So, and this huge gum tree, and that gum trees naturally drop limbs. It's actually really, it crushed my stepdaughter's car a few months ago, which was difficult. So they get stressed and they go, "See you later," and they'll let go of a tree limb. Sort of its own self-preservation. It's pretty remarkable, actually, but they call them a silent killer that way. It can be really dangerous. You don't camp under a gum tree. But I have no idea. That gum tree is clearly very old. Was it a sacred tree? What did that tree mean to the people who lived here before my house was plopped down? And this is where I was, when I moved here, this is where I live. We have a cave like 30 minutes up the road, a beautiful cave. That's for women's business, a cave to give birth.
Wow.
And I think actually the stories of our land where we all live come to life when we really learn about the people whose lands this was. Another good example is Australia's coastline was about 20 kilometers further out than where it is now. So even when you're swimming at the beach, you're swimming over footsteps. Who knows
Wow.
what's underneath you and what happened? And so bringing the stories of where we are, it changes the way we walk when we're outside. It changes the way we think about the outdoors. And I am not an indigenous person, nor do I, claim to understand their knowledge. But coming to Australia, where we sort of teach about we have Indigenous elders work at our university and try to teach us about connection to the country. That there is, for 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 the people that I've listened to on my campus, there is no happy people on an unhealthy climate. And so, if I think we can really amplify how we help youth recognize that when we fence things off, when we say what's ours and not yours, and when we don't think of the natural world as a place not only for mental health prevention and health, we didn't even get into physical activity as a preventative measure for our own well-being. Um, even vitamin D, vitamin C, all these things that we can get from all this wonderful stuff. It's I do think it's incredible to take time to really learn who are the traditional owners of where you are, how can I meet them, and how can I support that community with the privilege that I have to do that. Because I know in the United States and in Australia and in Canada, we also have a third world country, where we have put the people whose lands we've taken from them, and we give them pennies for what
Right.
has happened. And
Yeah.
I think it really starts with acknowledging this and acknowledging that, um, when we have that acknowledgement of when we're going outside, we're not using nature, we're being with it. And when we think about that human nature kinship, I think it changes the way we go outside. And I know we have to wrap up. I'll end with a funny story here. And because it kind of goes full circle. My wife and I went to Tasmania for the first time, probably 2 Novembers ago, and we go on this hike, beautiful hike in Freycinet National Park, and we you get to this beach called Hazards Beach. It's stunning, and it's about there's a boardwalk and a 3-story staircase down to the beach, and there's these piles of shells at the top of the staircase. And my wife said, "This is weird. Do you think the tide comes up this high?" It's a very flat beach, like not big waves. And I said, "No, Renee, the tide does not come up this high." And she said, "Really? Where's your tide chart, smartass?" Right? And so I was like, "Wait, you're right. Why would I even pretend I know anything about this beach?" Oddly enough, when we got back to the parking lot where we parked to do this loop trail, there's all this information about Hazards Beach, and it says, like, did you see the shells? Those are old, what are called middens. It's basically an indigenous trash pile because they ate shellfish and oysters. And there's old stories of when the colonists came. There's a matriarch society, and there were women that could hold their breath for 7 minutes to dive and get oysters.
Wow.
And so there's these piles of shells that you would walk right past if you didn't know that story. And you'd think, is this the tide? No, it's like even more unnatural. It's people, it's their story from thousands of years. And oddly enough, I took my mom back there just last week, and I did that walk again. And the way it changes what you're looking at. It changes how you're going, this was someone's home.
Yeah.
There were people here. And as a Marylander, these kind of look like the crab boils that we have. you know, like it's amazing how your view of the natural environment changes from a beautiful place to have a sense of wonder to also a sense of history. That there's amazing cultural history and you know um, archaeological history and anthropological. It's incredible. And I think sometimes when we think about that idea of the natural world, we can also not think about it as something for us to use, but as a place that is so rich of history and context. And that's where I say I have this huge, amazing tree that's a giant pain in the ass that might have been a very important tree to somebody else.
You never know. Yeah, well, I think sharing those
You
stories
never
is
know.
absolutely important for fostering that nature kinship. And, I
Mm.
said that Kansas is 98% private land, but I do have a little park near me. It's only 165 acres. It's got about 2 miles of trails. But out here in Kansas, this park, what I've learned about it was an area where you like I do live on stolen lands. My university is on stolen lands. There's a burial mound at the top of this little park there. It's called Mount Mitchell Heritage Prairie, and it's got a little burial mound on the top where some indigenous people had a burial site. Also, the Underground Railroad ran through the area out in Kansas.
Wow.
I didn't know the Underground Railroad came that far
Yeah.
west. But I think going back to everything you're saying, in order for humans need to be adapting to what we have, the way that in a lot of cultures, not every culture, but especially the American culture, has looked at the use of land. And that's going to be something that's going to be, that needs to change. And one way to do it is through sharing those stories, getting people to foster that nature kinship. It's really important.
Yeah. Absolutely. I totally agree.
Well, Will, this has been an amazing conversation. We've been going for about 90 minutes, and I could double this easily. I could easily double this. We got a lot in common. It's been really cool to connect. I mean, we connected on email before this. And on top of that, on top of just our connection, I wanted to thank you for bringing so much knowledge. I mean, I was amazed at how easy you were able to just riddle stuff off. I'm like, this guy's got a lot of experience. And I mean, that type of like just talking like that comes from like you've been doing this work for a while, and like I said in the introduction, almost 2 decades, and you're just full of experiences. So hey, thanks for connecting. I know that it's probably 7 a.m. or 9:45. There you go, 9:45 a.m. on the next day forward. So I'm in the nighttime behind. Now, I feel bad that I'm going to put on some outro music here to conclude the episode. Now, I wish I had some Minor Threat specifically or some punk rock to put on, but I don't. I'm going to put on the same as the intro music because that's what I have. But gosh, hey, Will, the other thing I want to say thanks to was I've had a lot of fun, so thank you.
Yeah, no, it's I love my friend in Norway who unfortunately passed away during COVID. My buddy Life, he said to me, my motto is like Google, share everything. So I don't know if we covered enough about adventure therapy or the outdoors, but we certainly shared a lot. And so that is always a treat.
Yeah. Well, you shared a lot, and I tried to keep up. I tried to keep up.
Thank you so much.
All right, you're welcome. I'm gonna throw on that outro music.